By the spring of 1945, the Allied powers begin their final attacks on Berlin, the capital of Germany at this time. And this is again the Reichstag, the German Congress. You can see it's all pitted with bullets and shelling and all of that. It's decided by General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, to allow the Russians to take the city of Berlin. He understands that the Russians believe they deserve to take Berlin, that they suffered the most casualties of any of the main Allied powers throughout World War II, both in cost of human lives and also economic damage, and they deserve those. It's also understood that Hitler's devoted to a fanatical defense. He's willing to sacrifice the German people to hold off the inevitable defeat of his Third Reich. He gets young boys to serve in the army. He is telling men to hold every block, blow up bridges, booby traps, all of that. And by April, the war is winding down. Now, FDR dies on April 12th. He doesn't see the final defeat, but on April 30th, you can see here the Red Army has captured Berlin. This is a famous photograph of the Red Army waving the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. And Hitler commits suicide in his bunker in the city of Berlin. Now, this is a photograph while we were letting the Russians take Berlin and suffering a lot of casualties doing it. We pivoted towards, some more easier targets to some degree. This is the airborne 101st Division, enjoying the reward of taking Hitler's Eagle's Nest, his mountain retreat that you probably have seen in some footage of Hitler prior to this moment. And when news comes out that Hitler is dead, it kind of stuns a lot of people, right? That this great dictator who was bent on European and global domination had no choice but to hide in a bunker, right? And deteriorate and eventually just commit suicide. Now, initially, it's interesting because people had suspected that Hitler had tried to escape. Again, it's a very chaotic period. There were a lot of Nazis that slipped through Allied lines and smuggled themselves to other countries, largely to parts of Latin America, to hide out and get new disguises and things like that. So it was believed for a time that Hitler may have attempted to do the same. So here's some mock-up photos of what Hitler disguise may have looked like. But ultimately, it's decided that he is dead. The Russians basically grab his remains, which have been burned, and transport them back in a sealed container to the Soviet Union. They were kept in, I believe, Red Square for many years, and then in the late 70s, I believed that they dumped his ashes in Siberia somewhere. The Soviet Union did not want any sort of, shrine for Adolf Hitler in the future. And anyway, the big takeaway for us again is that by May 8th, the command of Nazi Germany, after Hitler has committed suicide, decides to basically just sign an armistice to end the war and formally surrender to the Allied powers unconditionally, okay, which was again spelled out in the Casablanca Conference. And so this is Churchill, basically overseeing Trafalgar Square in London, throwing up the V for victory, right, at this time. So this is a huge moment. VE Day, victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945. And sadly, again, FDR never got to witness this, great moment. Now, American propaganda largely focused on targeting the enemy, right, their government, their systems, not necessarily individuals. That was largely true for our propaganda against Nazi Germany, a bit less so against Imperial Japan. For instance, we referred to Japanese as Jap, which is seen as derogatory, name calling today. Here you can see that the Japanese enemy is depicted as subhuman, weird color skin, fangs, dripping blood, right, and so forth. And so, to some degree, the American government dehumanized the enemy. And the fight in the Pacific, in some ways, is a bit more ruthless than it was in the Eastern Front. One big reason for that is that we view them as a different race, the culture is quite different, and German units in Europe were much more likely to surrender faster than their counterparts in the Pacific, fighting American forces. So basically what ends up happening is that we have to kind of, again, island hop to get closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. The biggest naval engagement ever in military history occurs in the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's a decisive American victory, and this really does break the back of the Japanese Navy. At this point, they really can't stop an effective blockade of the Japanese islands, and it's significant because now what's left is to just again actually take the islands. So even beyond the loss of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Empire refuses to surrender, right? Even though they can't push us back with their navy anymore. So what ends up happening is that we start to finally land on Japanese home islands by 1945. The first of which is the island of Iwo Jima, which is tied to this very famous photograph. A lot of you have seen this. If you go to Washington, D.C., this is near Arlington Cemetery, and it's basically the memorial for the U.S. Marine Corps. And Iwo Jima was, at that time, the costliest battle ever in Marine Corps history. What ends up happening is the Japanese dig in, despite 3 days of naval bombardment on the island. They hold the high ground. They dig in and built a tunnel system in Mount Suribachi, which oversaw the whole island. And they waited for American Marines to land in big numbers before, basically just letting loose on transport ships and the guys on the island. And it was incredibly bloody to secure that island. And the Japanese at this point want to make clear that any attempt to take Japanese soil will result in an incredible amount of casualties. And sadly, that continues, right? In June of 1945, we push into the next big Japanese island, Okinawa. And this was one of the worst battles in Marine Corps history. In Okinawa, the Japanese let us land unopposed and get in the island before conducting any resistance. And it led to really severe losses for the United States Marine Corps. And I would encourage you guys to watch these videos. One of the things that the Japanese started using a lot more of were kamikaze attacks, right? Kamikaze, again, meaning divine wind, which in World War II referenced basically suicide attacks, where, for instance, pilots, as I'm sure you guys would aware, would sign a will, have a funeral ceremony, have a drink and praise the emperor. And again, this was seen as maintaining their honor, right? This interpretation of the Code of Bushido in Japanese culture. And a one-way ticket. They would fly their planes into American ships and could do far more damage, right, if they connected with their targets. And this is something that wasn't really seen in Europe, despite all the casualties there. And again, it gives a different feel to the war in the Pacific. And they're attacking not just Marines on land, but also, again, with the planes, our ships in the Pacific as well. On land, some kamikaze attacks typically were guys being strapped in landmines, given a hammer, stuck in a hole, covered, and waiting to feel the rumble of American tanks overhead, and then just boom, letting go. And this really does, the losses in Okinawa are so severe. It's over 25,000 casualties for the Marine Corps at Okinawa, that you have severe combat fatigue in the soldiers, so morale is slipping. And we're not yet on the main home islands yet. And the belief is, if we're suffering so much, all right, in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, what does that mean if we have to actually invade, right, the main home islands? Are we looking at an insane amount of casualties? And one report from the War Department basically made clear that a planned invasion of Hokkaido, the southernmost island of Japan, main island, would result in over 1 million casualties for U.S. Military forces. And what this means now is that increasingly President Truman, right, is hoping for the successful test of a new super weapon, right, with the Manhattan Project. Here's a photograph of the fighting in Iwo Jima. In the background, you can see Mount Suribachi, again, tunnel systems where guns could rain down on American forces. And as American forces try to work their way up to capture the high ground, they're, getting hit by the enemy along the entire way. But at the top, raising that flag, raising the spirits and the men still landing. And this is, again, a photograph of the aftermath of a kamikaze attack, right? Striking an American carrier and blowing up, right? Probably aiming for the command tower here. But, again, it's really heavy losses and quite terrifying for the men engaged in this combat. Here you can see that we are working our way up. Iwo Jima, the Red Star, Okinawa is here. And the southernmost island right here, again, Hokkaido. And you can see one big name here, Nagasaki, and then further north, Hiroshima. as we're conducting these last island hopping campaigns, we are now close enough to conduct really devastating bombing raids on Japan, which we are doing, resulting in really heavy losses for the Japanese people. We're conducting firebombing again with huge fleets of bombers day and night. And what ends up happening is that in Japan, most of the buildings are made of wood. So the fires are even more devastating, and hundreds of thousands of civilians are dying. And yet the military government of Japan is refusing to surrender, as bad as this is, as the war continues to drag on. The Manhattan Project. So this is really kind of incredible when you look at it. The Manhattan Project is a code name for the secret development of a new weapon to help win World War II, based on the principles of nuclear fission, right? Splitting the atom. And I apologize for those of you who are far more, aware of all the scientific properties of this, but I'm going to summarize as best as I can. Fission, again, is basically splitting an atom. So in the late 30s, multiple scientists, and this guy here is one of them, Dr. Fermi of Italy, as well as some Nazi scientists. We had some Americans as well pursuing this sort of cutting-edge particle physics research in college labs at Columbia and Berkeley. In the late 30s, they discovered that you can split an atom, right? And theoretical physics starts to dictate that it could, if you can do a chain reaction of that, it can generate tremendous power, right? And just raw energy. And Einstein, right, is informed of this, and through his influence is able to convince, again, FDR to approve essentially spending on scientific research for weapon technology. By 1942, it develops into the Manhattan Project, and it's overseen for the scientists by a man, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. He's the leader of the development, overseeing kind of all the research, and there's multiple locations in the United States, in Columbia University. Oak Ridge, Tennessee did a lot of experimentation for the Manhattan Project and radioactive materials, what you would need, the fuel source to harness such a weapon. And then ultimately the main test site where they would construct the devices was in Alamogordo Air Base in New Mexico. So it was a relationship of scientists and the U.S. Army, right? So Oppenheimer really kind of reports to an Army general, Leslie Groves. And the big thing is we know that this is so top secret and has such huge ramifications if it ever proves to be successful that General Groves decides to compartmentalize it. So you don't let everyone know what's happening all at once in all different parts of the program. You only need to know what you need to know for what you're doing. And if you're unsure of what you're doing, right, matters in the long run, well, that's not your concern. And to be fair, in hindsight, that proved to be accurate. The Soviets had spies, and they started finding out about the Manhattan Project before it was even successfully concluded, which you could argue really is proof that the Cold War started before World War II even actually ended. Ultimately, the Manhattan Project achieved success despite a lot of suspicions that it would not. In July of 1945, the Trinity test. So this is a photograph of that mushroom cloud. And just to give you a sense of the power of this one new device, right? First of all, this moment right here starts in world history what we call the atomic age. And we have basically tapped into cosmic forces. Nuclear fission, again, the splitting of the atom and the chain reaction that followed with radioactive material generates essentially a small sun, unleashing a tremendous amount of power, about 20 or 30,000 times that of like TNT. And so the belief is this super weapon could actually level cities, right, and could conclude the war far more quickly than a traditional sort of invasion. This is a photograph of Dr. Oppenheimer on the left and General Groves on the right visiting the site where the device detonated. And you can see that the sand is all caked here, and because the blast was so hot that it actually turned a lot of the sand close to the explosion site into glass. And here's an aerial view of the crater, right, and the burn marks further out. So this is a new super weapon. And the question is, when are we going to use it on Japan, right? The last opponent left by this point with this successful conclusion of the Trinity test.